Originally set in the glitz and glamour of 19th century Paris, La Traviata has been the #1 most performed opera in the world for the last 5 years. From the music that you're pretty much guaranteed to recognize to the drama and the ultimate tragedy of the evening, La Traviata is literally everything you could ever want from a night at the opera. And today, we will find out why, on Scores Unstitched. While it's really easy to just enjoy La Traviata for the simple and heartbreaking tragedy it is, which is probably part of why it's so popular, there's actually a lot of depth around the topics of disease, morality, and even Verdi himself that are more interesting than you might think at first glance. Or at least I'm going to make them interesting to keep this channel relevant. So we're going to switch things up a little today and start with a brief outline of the characters and plot first before we start exploring some of the context. So the first of our 3 big characters is Violetta, a courtesan living... courtesan? She's living this totally like Versace on the floor kind of lifestyle in Paris, but she's secretly battling a chronic illness that only she and her doctor and her maid know about. Now, while we never actually find out what it is, there are multiple times that she coughs up blood, has muscle weakness, mentions how pale she is, or just straight up passes out. And not in like that fake helpless Bridgerton kind of way, but just the really unsexy like mid-conversation. Now, in the 1850s, when this opera was premiered, you didn't have to say that this was tuberculosis. Everyone knew. But because the symptoms are actually only ever referred to as an illness in the actual opera, Violetta's disease could, in theory, be left open to interpretation. Which means you could theoretically see a production adapted for modern times with more close to home for us illnesses like cancer or HIV. And maybe I just delight in operatic chaos, but I actually think that could be super cool. Anyways, next we have Violetta's eventual lover, Alfredo. And no judgment if you call him Alfred. Alfredo tends to like make me feel like the guy kind of smells like cheese. He's this young romantic man from an upper middle class family in Provence who falls for Violetta way before she falls for him. But you can hardly blame the guy. It was kind of her job to make him feel like she was interested. I mean, before she actually was. And then lastly, we have Alfredo's father, Germont. Now, as far as controlling and manipulative dads go, he's actually a pretty decent guy. But he's not super pleased that his son has fallen in love with a courtesan, and he's really not pleased when they run off and start living together outside matrimony. So a few months after Violetta and Alfredo run off together, he comes looking for them at their country home outside Paris and tells Violetta that Alfredo has a sister he never told her about, and she's engaged, but her fiance has threatened to break their engagement because of her brother's scandalous affair with a prostitute. So he asks her to end her relationship with Alfredo for the sake of his family. And Violetta's torn. You know, she wants to help, she knows it makes sense, but she also knows she's dying, and she's terrified of dying alone. Who wouldn't be? But how the rest of the story unravels, I'll leave for the performers to tell when you go to see La Traviata. So, let's talk about her dying for a sec. What was the deal with tuberculosis? I mean, it seems like it was a pretty popular way to go, but also there wasn't really much panic about it when there probably definitely should have been. Tuberculosis was a contagious disease, and all those people being really close to each other in these tiny, poorly ventilated houses, inhaling each other's coughs and touching the ones who were fainting and coughing up blood, I mean, weren't they scared? But in terms of medical timelines, germ theory was actually in its infancy at this point, and barely accepted by scientists, let alone the public. So contagiousness wasn't a known thing. So then how did people think tuberculosis happened in the 1850s? Miasma theory, the idea that people could get sick from nighttime air, was the unbelievable now, but accepted then explanation. Good people, moral people, who stayed indoors at night and didn't expose themselves to the debauchery and sinful lifestyles of the after dark crowd, were safer from miasma. So tuberculosis was thought of as an accepted lifestyle risk. To them, getting tuberculosis was kind of like a smoker getting cancer. Still very sad, of course, but it's not as if the risks were unknown. So morally speaking, it's up to the audience to decide if the ultimate ending of her story is appropriate for the disease that it's thought she brought on herself. Okay, so now that we're familiar with some historical context and our basic plot and characters, let's look at some of the other stuff to know when you go to see La Traviata. La Traviata was written by Giuseppe Verdi, with a libretto by Francesco Piave, who had also recently worked with him on Rigoletto. The opera was composed pretty quickly. In February of 1852, Verdi and his girlfriend, more on her in a second, saw a play called La Dame aux Camélias in Paris by French author and playwright Alexandre Dumas. Verdi apparently started composing music for a new opera based on the play that night. Just over a year later, La Traviata was premiered in Venice in March of 1853. But in the weeks leading up to the premiere, it kind of became obvious that La Traviata was interestingly close to Verdi's heart. He was incredibly invested in its success, first fighting tooth and nail for it to be set in modern times, the 1850s, a choice the director ultimately refused because he thought it was too immoral and scandalous to be an accurate representation of modern life for modern audiences. And while he was still fighting that decision, Verdi found out that the soprano Fanny Salvini Donatelli had been cast as Violetta, and to say he was unhappy is putting it a bit mildly. He'd been told she was the only soprano with the ability to actually perform the very vocally demanding role, but at 38 years old, she was, in his mind anyways, way too old to pass for a young courtesan, and her body also didn't quite fit the standard of beauty accepted by Italians in the 1850s. So vocal prowess aside, Verdi was convinced the audience would never accept her, and he apparently had the audacity to tell her so to her face. Repeatedly. But now, okay, we need some context here. Let's revisit Verdi's girlfriend. Her name was Giuseppina Strepponi. Yes, they had the same first name. And if the term girlfriend strikes your ear a little weird, you're not the only one. The couple met in Paris in 1847 when Giuseppe was 34 and Giuseppina was 31. And both of them had already lived through their share of tragedy. We'll start with Verdi. Verdi married young at 23. His wife was called Margherita, and together they had 2 children, a daughter and a son. Verdi apparently adored and doted on his whole family, but 1 month after their son was born, their daughter died, followed by their son a year later. And then not even a year after that, Margherita herself died of encephalitis. Verdi was only 26. Meanwhile, Giuseppina was traveling Europe as an incredibly successful soprano. She'd made her debut on the Italian stage at 19, but as her fame grew, so did her notoriety. In the 12 years of her career, she had 3 illegitimate children. So by the time she was 31, the stress of both her singing schedule and the medical stress of her pregnancies resulted in severe vocal complications that forced her to retire early. So she moved to Paris to start fresh as a singing teacher. Now let's think about Violetta again. A courtesan, a young woman taking many lovers outside of wedlock, living a life of fame and parties in Paris, but subject to secret medical distress that ultimately leads to rejection by her friends and loved ones, and a fabulous soprano to boot. Now, who does it sound like Giuseppe might have gotten attached to? But even if we put aside Verdi's personal attachment to Violetta, and focus on his distress at the opera's premiere, he was right. It was a disaster. By the time the second act came around, the audience had started shouting super rude comments at poor Fanny. Totally wouldn't fly today, but public bullying was apparently all the rage back then. It wasn't actually until a year later, when La Traviata was restaged with an entirely different cast, that the opera got the review it deserved. And then from there, it launched itself to worldwide fame, and the rest is history. Now, La Traviata is 3 acts long, normally with 2 intermissions. The first act is really short at about 35 minutes. Then the second act is just over an hour, with about 20 minutes of that being pure entertainment of, chorus and ballet without any plot development. And then the third is really short again, another 35 minutes. So okay, what about this famous music? Well, honestly, we could be here all day. There's a reason this opera is so dang popular. It's legit just banger after banger, from, drinking songs to beautiful duets to, music that makes you want to make your own pasta. So we're just going to look at a handful of themes and a couple of the more famous arias and duets, and I know I'm leaving stuff out. You're just going to have to hear it in the opera itself. Now, there are 2 main themes to be on the lookout for, but thankfully Verdi thought ahead and he popped them in the overture. Thoughtful of him. So the first is kind of like a mood setter for the opera, and it never really gets louder than a pianissimo. It's just, deliciously tragic. You're gonna hear it throughout the entire opera, of course, but certainly into the final act when things, really start to go downhill. This is what it sounds like. So it starts in this lovely C minor. And then we start to kind of transition into the major, but, not before we start getting some chromaticism in here. And here it kind of sounds like we could resolve into that major. But no, instead, what we get is a little bit more waiting. And this is where that kind of Bach-like harmony, that inspiration kind of comes in. And then here, we finally get the resolution. And oh my God, is that not just the most heartbreaking, almost like there's a ray of hope, but we know it's just not going to go that way. Oh, so beautiful. And then right after this theme in the opening of the overture, we get the love theme for Violetta and Alfredo. This one is really scattered everywhere and in all kinds of different ways, and this is what it sounds like. Lovely little Italian melody, right? So those are our two recurring themes, but then we have a few arias and duets to look out for. In Act 1, there are two biggies. The first is the incredibly famous Brindisi, or drinking song, sung by Alfredo. No one knows why they know this, but it's one of those tunes you've definitely heard that makes you go, this is from an opera? So keep that nugget in your back pocket for trivia night. The other is one of Violetta's arias called Sempre, libera, or Always Free, where Violetta dances around her room in sort of a delirium brought on by her fever. And of course, while it's fun to listen to, it's also an interesting one to note because this aria is what makes this role so difficult. Remember how hard it was for Verdi to find a soprano. And if it's really good, and so is the rest of the opera, write down that soprano's name for future reference. She's really rare. Then Act 2 opens right out of the gate with a beautiful aria from Alfredo called the miei bollenti spiriti, or My Passionate Spirit. Alfredo is reliving the last few months that he spent with Violetta and how happy they've been. And then a little later in the second act, we get an unprecedented 7 songs featuring Alfredo's father and Violetta, smattered with arias and duets that are just too gorgeous and too many to cite here, but the character development is amazing, so just enjoy. And then in the third act, we get another stunning aria from Violetta, Addio del passato bei sogni ridenti, farewell, happy dreams of the past. Violetta's reading a letter and mourning her loss, but I won't say of what, because spoilers. And like I said, there's so much more to dig into here, but for your first Traviata, I think you're good to go. This show is such an opulent, dramatic thing with all kinds of familiar melodies, and it's just like the quintessential definition of opera. Plus, for me, I've always loved tragic stories, and not just operas, but like books and movies too. They feel, I don't know, like cathartic somehow. They always leave me feeling like my life is just so much better. What do you think preferring tragedies over comedies says about somebody? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. And until next time, I hope you're having an inspiring week, and thanks for joining me on Scores Unstitched.